Ai che he guys like festa Copernicus ma ai capio ai himabe quick ai che kapega kai by Copernicus ikyo. So that means the Copernicus Festival is very nice. Other festivals are not so nice. And I learn a lot at the Copernicus Festival. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here with you. It's quite an honor to be in Krakow. I have been in Poznan twice over the last couple of years, and it's always a joy to come to Poland. I feel like I should do some field research here and learn some of the language, which I haven't yet had an opportunity to do. So tonight, if you want to take one message away from this talk, it's that language, according to my theory, and I think it's right, or I wouldn't tell you, is 1.5 million years old at least, and began with Homo erectus. So that's what we're going to talk about, mainly about Homo erectus. Language is a biocultural behavior. It is partly biological, partly cultural. It engages the entire human being. We learn languages not just with our mouths or our brains, but with our entire body. So language engages all of us, and it emerges from our rich history as a species. So what evidence would we have to appeal to be able to talk about the origins of language? Well, in fact, although there are no fossilized words, there are plenty of sources of evidence to construct an understanding of the origin of language. So we have archaeology, and a lot of the talk tonight will be about archaeology. We will talk about linguistics. Field research is another source. Semiotics, this theory of signs, comparative biology, philosophy, cognitive science, paleo-neuroscience, neuroscience, evolutionary theory, and genetics. We're not going to talk about all that tonight. We're going to focus primarily on archaeology and linguistics. So to begin a discussion of how language evolved, we need to start with what language is. There are two alternative perspectives on what language is. One defines language in terms of grammar, so that it's a set of sentences described by a recursive grammar. Another definition of language, the one I will assume here, is the transfer of information by symbols. So in my perspective, the crucial difference between human communication and animal communication is the use of symbols. All entities in the world communicate. Arguably, even a thermostat on the wall. So if you set the temperature on your thermostat to 18 degrees, and it gets information from the environment that it is not at 18 degrees, it will respond and bring the temperature down to 18 degrees. So just about everything in the world communicates. But only humans have language. And once again, the reason for that is just about everything in the world can interpret some signs, but only humans can interpret and mainly invent symbols. So I'll define communication as the transfer of information by signs, and language as the transfer of information by symbols. The types of signs that we're going to be assuming for this is an index, which is any sign that is connected to what it refers to physically. So a footprint, a smell, pointing your finger, these are physical connections to the things that they represent. An icon is something that looks like what it's going to represent. It could be a blueprint, a diagram, a picture, a painting. These are all iconic. The sculptures by Henry Moore out front are iconic. And then a symbol is a sign that picks out something, some meaning, by cultural agreement. So in English, a dog refers to canine because, in effect, English speakers have agreed that's what we're going to call that. And that's what makes a symbol different from icons and indexes. The threshold to symbols, was this gradual or sudden? There are some linguists and some people who've written on language appearance who have argued that it's very sudden, that it appeared not only with our species, but not even at the beginning of our species, but that it's only 100 to 150,000 years old. Some even say 50,000 years old. My perspective is much more Darwinian, so I believe that we find the vestiges or the beginning aspects of language in many other species. So my view is that language is 1.5 million to 2 million years old, and I'll try to give you some evidence that that's the case. So I think language has been found on Earth for at least 60,000 generations. When Homo neanderthalensis was born, they were born into a linguistic world. When our species originated, people were already talking. Speech is secondary. Many people want to know what kinds of sounds early humans could make. There's a division of opinion on that. There are some who believe that early humans couldn't make the full range of sounds that we can make today. There are others who think they probably could make the full range of sounds. But my point is that it's irrelevant whether they could make the full range of sounds or not, because you don't need the full range of modern human sounds to have language. For example, how many sounds does a computer have? It has only two, 0 and 1. It has only two ways to get across its information. And with 0 and 1, it can communicate anything. Of course, computers have large memories. So the more sounds you have, the less memory is required. But the Pitaha language that I work with has only 13 sounds if you're a man and 12 sounds if you're a woman. It has 7 consonants for women, 8 consonants for men, 3 vowels for both, and 2 tones. And with that, you're able to communicate. In fact, the tones are important because over 1,000 languages in the world use tones to communicate, like Chinese and Vietnamese and Pitaha. And if you have tones, the consonants and vowels become even less important. So what speech capacity Homo erectus had is almost, not entirely, but almost irrelevant to whether or not it had language. And this is our hero. Recently, my wife and I did DNA tests to see where we come from. And you'll be shocked to know that my DNA is 97% Northern European. And my wife's is the same. You sort of look at us and you get that idea. But ultimately, all of our DNA, actually we did DNA tests of our dogs too, which was even more fun. But all of us go back to Homo erectus. So some people say, if Homo erectus had language, why did they disappear? Well, they lasted a lot longer than we have lasted so far. And in one sense, we are them. So they became us. So they haven't disappeared. Homo erectus lived from almost 2 million years ago to 140,000, some say 60,000 years ago. So that's a long period of time. We've only been on the planet for about 300,000 years. They stood about 5'8" to 5'11", so that's like 1.75 to 1.80 m or something like that, average height. So they were tall on average. They had brains of about 950 cc's. Our brains are about 1,300 cc's, although some European women's average brain size is 950 cc's, which simply shows you that the size of the brain doesn't indicate intelligence. It's only one of the factors. So their brain size was in our range. They were found all over the world, and they had different forms. They vary quite a bit all over the world, just like we do. Just like you can find many varieties of sapiens, you could find many varieties of Homo erectus. So again, there are always opposing views that we've talked about here, and the main thing to get across is that there's one view that is non-Darwinian, that language came about very suddenly, and the other view that language came about through Darwinian evolution, which means that it came about gradually, and we should be able to find signs of it in other species. And if we look at the evolution of the brain, we find that in this middle part here, drawn with a circle, we find overlap between Neanderthals, which actually had bigger brains than ours. They had brains of about 1,450 cc's. But we find much overlap between Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo sapiens. There were many other proposed species of the genus Homo, but I'm only going to talk about these three because these are the three we're most certain about. And this is the most recent, or one of the most recent models of human ancestry, where we came from. So you can see that Erectus led to all kinds of other creatures, and we are one of them. That Erectus led to Neanderthals, Erectus came into sapiens, so in a sense, we are all the descendants of Homo erectus. So when you do your DNA test and it tells you your family's from Africa, that's not a surprise. We are all from Africa. 19th century philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, who I am writing a biography now of, was one of the most, I think, the most brilliant person to ever come out of the United States. And he made contributions in a variety of areas. But the area we want to talk about tonight is his theory of signs, what is called semiotics. And in semiotics, there's a picture of Peirce. He was despised. He was fired from the only job he ever had at a university and lived his life in poverty, but felt it was his duty to write daily. So when he died, 140,000 pages of brilliant work was discovered, and it was discovered that he invented logic before Frege. He was the first person to measure the wavelength of light and relate it to the meter. So the meter is roughly corresponds to wavelength of light. That's owed to Peirce. Many other discoveries. The first person to find that the Milky Way rotated. And then some ideas of mind that are important. One that I call dark matter of the mind. We know lots of things we do not know we know. We learn these things by daily experience, by interacting with others. And when that dark matter of the mind overlaps, when what you know sort of overlaps with what I know, we can be said to share cultural information. So dark matter of the mind is just what we know, but we're not normally able to explain. Like, why do I stand like this? Peter Haas stand like this. Why do they stand like that? Well, if I ask them to explain that to me, they're not going to be any more able to explain that than me standing like this. We take up more space because we don't walk in the jungle. We walk side by side. Peter Haas walk one after the other, and they stand like this because it takes less space. And if you're in the jungle, my wife was the first one to notice this for me. She said, oh, that's how you dive. She's a scuba diver. And she said, when you dive, you have your arms like this because you take up less space. So I thought about it. Yeah, that's a good explanation. But it's dark matter of the mind that tells us how we sit. Peter Haas sit different than us. They stand different than us. They walk different than us. And many other cultures do the same. There's a lot of variation. Culture, which is so important to me and to many other researchers, is an abstract network that shapes and connects our social roles, our knowledge structures, and our values. Our values and the way we rank our values. So, for example, you might think that eating good food is of value. And you might also think that staying in good physical shape is of value. If you rank good food over shape, you'll look different than if you rank being in shape over good food, even though you value both. So how you rank the values is also very important. So there's a concept called universal grammar. I don't want to spend much time on it. The first person in the United States to propose this was not Noam Chomsky, but Charles Sanders Peirce, who argued that universal grammar is based around how we interpret signs. Later, Chomsky proposed universal grammar, but for Peirce, it was not innate, it was not genetic, it was logical. For Chomsky, it was innate. I'm not going to refer much more to these ideas because I think that there are some widespread features of human language, but that the explanation is the problem of communication, and the differences are the result of culture. Now we want to talk about tools, because when we talk about Homo erectus, we have to have an understanding of where tools come from, because tools are really some of the best evidence we have of erectus. We're going to see that we actually have a lot of evidence about how smart and how active Homo erectus was. But first we need to think about their tools, because they left stone tools behind us. Recently I was with my colleague Larry Barham at the University of Liverpool, and Larry and I are doing research on Homo erectus tools, And we were holding a 500,000-year-old scraper that Larry had just brought back from Africa. And his colleague walked in, who is considered John Gowlett, one of the world's greatest authorities on stone tools. And he looked at the scraper and he told us, he said, "Oh, that's from East Africa. It doesn't look like what the rest of West Africans made." So 500,000 years ago, Homo erectus was already dividing their tools. Their tools look different according to which culture they came from. So tools are individual devices or processes that meet perceived needs of individuals and communities. They're a set of devices, processes, and expertise used to harness the properties of a particular material. But their full culturally constructed repertoire of knowledge, you can't build tools without cultural understanding. So we know that other species use tools, but no other species stores tools, carries tools as long as humans, and makes tools according to a fixed pattern. So although you might find a chimpanzee using a tool in one purpose, and that is learned, humans use tools in a very different way. So in a sense, we still are the tool-using species. Human technology enmeshes the material with the ideational. We have an idea, and we turn it into material. That's where technology comes to play. And it's constructed socially, and tools always become symbols. If I have a tool that I use for gardening, and I look at that tool, it's going to remind me of gardening. It symbolizes what it's used for. And that's a very important fact to remember about tools. They always become symbols in human cultures. The learning of technical skills takes place using a combination of abilities, we have done a number of experiments. I say we, I mean people at the University of Liverpool and other large departments of archaeology have done experiments with stone tool construction. And some of the tools I'm going to show you look very simple, but it takes a PhD student about 500 hours of practice to learn how to make these tools. So they may look simple, but they're not. They're difficult to make, and they wanted me to try to make some so that I could get an experience, but I talked to one of the PhD students and she said, "Your hands will get very bloody because you're going to miss a lot." So I said, I'll do that next time. And so I have also seen a lot of tools made in the Amazon that we might consider trivial, like bows and arrows and blowguns, and yet those are extremely complex things. The other thing we know about tools is that just example is not enough, not even for stone tools. There has to be some verbal explanation and correction to be able to make these tools. Experiments done with Homo sapiens PhD students and Homo sapiens professors find that they cannot make the tools simply watching somebody else make them. They have to be corrected, they have to be instructed. So signs, especially symbols, icons, indexes, have three basic components. There's an object we want to talk about, so if I point there, the object, and then my pointing is the sign, and the way we interpret it is that there. So all signs, whether they're indexes, icons, or symbols, have objects, representations, and interpretation. All animals use indexes. In fact, I would say that everything, all living life, at least, uses indexes. How do trees know when to drop their leaves? The shortening of the days. So even trees, in a sense, take the index of the shortening of the days and interpret it as, this is the time to drop my leaves. Not mentally, although Peirce would have said, in a sense, even trees have a mind. They're non-intentional in the sense that if I smell something, it doesn't have to be my intention to smell it. As soon as I smell it, I know that the originator of the smell is nearby. They're non-arbitrary. So an index is determined by the thing that causes it. There's nothing arbitrary about it. So smoke is caused by fire. We don't use a cloud to indicate fire. That would be arbitrary. We use a smoke signal. And they show something, like if I smell something and I can't see it, it's not in my immediate environment, it's displaced. That turns out to be very important for language. when something is not here, but we can still talk about it. Icons look like things. They're also non-intentional. If something looks like something else, well, that's just the way it is. I can create a painting, in which case I intend for it to look like something else, but if I see my reflection in the water, I don't intend for my reflection to look like me. It just does. They're non-arbitrary and they're displacement. And symbols are very different from these. The conceptual step from icons and indexes to symbols is not that big conceptually, but it is crucial for language. As Neil Armstrong said when he stepped on the moon, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. So the symbols were cognitively, in a sense, small steps, but they led to a giant leap for our species. And they are intentional. We intend to use the word dog to refer to canine when we use it in English. And they're prerequisites for language. No symbols, no language, period. There's no chance to have a language if you don't have symbols. So we have fossilized indexes. So these footprints are 3.7 million years old. They're left by Australopithecines. And if you look at them, Mary Leakey discovered these in Africa. You can see that there's a large Australopithecine and a small one, and they walk and they turn and look at something, and then they keep walking. So 3.7 million years ago, we can see probably a parent and a child roaming time together. Right after they passed over this, it must have rained, and this has a property like concrete, cement, so they hardened and have lasted for 3.7 million years. Now this guy, Australopithecus africanus, is our friend. They stood about this tall, in this range, and they were very strong. They had a terrible bite, but they walked upright just like we do. And they were the first ones to start making tools, of stone tools, and they were the first ones to start to contemplate icons, and we'll see evidence for that. So this is a 3 million year old pebble. It's called the Makapangseat Pebble. It was discovered in a cave in South Africa. It is about this big. It's currently in the British Museum in London. Most good artifacts from around the world are stolen and put in the British Museum. And it doesn't match the other stones in the cave or any of the stones around it. This stone came from miles away from the cave. Why do you think it was found in the cave? Why would Australopithecines carry this several miles to the cave? The easiest explanation, the most widely accepted explanation, is because it looks like a human face. So they or it looked like an Australopithecine face. There were no humans around at the time, probably. So they kept this because it reminded them of themselves. They looked at it. It was fascinating to them. It's the first example we have of a species recognizing and in a sense, contemplating an icon. Australopithecines also made tools. So, for example, 3.3 million years ago, we see the evidence for the first stone tool technology in Oldowan, a gorge in Tanzania. And these are called Oldowan tools. But there's no real design to them. Really, the way you make a tool like this is you take one rock and break another one, and then you have a tool. You get a sharp edge. So these are technologically very easy to do, and in fact, chimpanzees can make these same tools. Icons, resemblances. This is supposed to resemble Jesus. The Piraha asked me one time, Dan, what does Jesus look like? Is he dark like us, or is he white like you? And I said, well, some people say he was white like me, and other people say he was dark like you. Yeah, but you saw him, so what did he look like? And I said, well, actually, I never saw him. But your father saw him. No, my father never saw him. So they said, who do you know that saw him? Well, I don't know anybody who saw him. So why are you telling us about him? I didn't have sufficient information. But anyway, that's what some people think he might have looked like. Interesting hairdo. Also, we know that tools can be symbols. Here's a very common symbol that uses tools. This represents the power of labor, which many of the people who drew the tools never did, actually. So tools can be very important symbols. So if you get symbols, how do you make a language out of them? It turns out that field research across a wide variety of currently spoken languages, Pitaha, for example, suggests that for the syntax, for the basic grammar, really all you need are symbols in an agreed upon order. So you say, I'm going to put the subject first, and the verb second, and the object third, or I'm going to put the verb first, however you want to do it. But as soon as you agree on it, you've got a way of interpreting the symbols, you've got a grammar, you can say actually anything you want to say. That's all you need to say, anything that can be said in the world. It's hard for some people to recognize this fact. Anything natural. You can't say it in certain ways, but you can say it. We all know that when we learn another language, it won't have the same grammar that we have. And so we try to use our grammar, and we realize that's not going to work, so we have to learn that other grammar. So that's the way these languages would have been. They would have been simple symbols in a linear order, in an agreed upon order, and with that they could say anything, but they wouldn't have said it exactly like we do. The other kind of grammar is a grammar that has more structure to it. So maybe it has phrases like noun phrases or verb phrases. That's called a hierarchical grammar. Recent study by a Swedish linguist has argued that in most spoken European languages, that's all you find is hierarchy. You don't find elaborate recursive structures. And that's the final kind of grammar, is that it allows structures with both hierarchy and recursion. What is recursion? It means to reoccur, one thing occurring inside another of the same type. So I can say, the boy who was here yesterday, who everybody likes, is not going to be here today because he's not a very friendly boy. Something like that. That didn't make much sense. But you can put one sentence inside another. You would say the same thing in Pitaha as separate sentences. So they can interpret just as well as we can. Anybody can interpret that way, but we don't put that kind of structure in the grammar. So grammar is secondary, symbols are primary. Erectus also started to save icons, just as we do, just as Australopithecus do. So the first Erectus icon that we find in the world is found in modern-day Morocco, and it's this. This is actually a cuttlefish bone, but they carried this around with them and kept it. It apparently made them happy to have this, 300 to 700,000 years old. And then we start to see Erectus tools. And Erectus tools were quite complicated. It's a special kind of technology called Acheulean technology, and it lasted for over 1 million years, and it's a very effective stone tool technology. Modern research using very powerful microscopes studying these tools suggests that some of them did in fact have handles. They were more complex than just handheld, but these handheld axes require a lot of work. So they require shaping, they require imagination, they require intention, they require planning, and they require memory. Memory is a crucial component of human language. You have to have human-level memory to have grammar. But how much memory do you need? Not as much as you might think. A recent study by Steve Piantadosi and colleagues has shown that more or less what we need to remember any language is 1.5 megabytes of memory, roughly a floppy disk, and if you remember what a floppy disk is. So not that much. It's not nearly as complicated as we think. And the smallest thing we have to remember is the grammar. That's the easiest part. The number one thing that takes up memory are the symbols. Also, neuroscience work by Evelina Fedorenko at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology suggests that the language networks in the brain, the way we store language, grammar is secondary. What we mainly store are symbols. So all of this recent neuroscientific research supports the idea that symbols are what are crucial to human language. Homo erectus had several inventions and innovations. They were the first to control fire. They were the first to pre-shape stone tools, because to make some of these stone tools, you can't just start breaking off the tool. You have to break off some parts to leave a particular shape, and from that particular shape, you're able to derive the tool that you want. So it requires stages and planning, and they also used wood tools and bone tools. And if I'm correct, they made boats as well, which is a pretty elaborate tool. So again, we find these kinds of tools in Africa, and we find that the tools not only were built similar ways in particular cultures, we find that they colored the tools, that the tools played a role in their culture, but they put components of this on the tools that we would call style, things that went beyond function, that represented something about the person who made the tools. So these are very interesting facts about the tools. So that looks fairly simple, but again, this is the kind of tool that takes hundreds of hours for a PhD student who studied this to learn. And we find these going back over 1 million years. Hafting is the next step. Hafting is putting one tool together with another tool, making handles. That represents, so if you have a stone axe, that's great. If you have a hand axe with a handle, that's even better. So handles are very important, and finding handles, evidence for handles in stone tools of Homo erectus is very important, and we find such evidence. My colleague, Larry Barham, again, this has not yet been confirmed by a geologist, but it looks like there's a site in Ghana where there was a multi-step dyeing process for tools to color tools differently by an Erectus community. If the date is confirmed, that will be the oldest evidence we know of decoration and function, and that certainly goes beyond what is needed for the tools and represents symbolic value of the people. So just give a few more examples. There's a hand axe, there's a cleaver, these all have different functions. There's a pick. We find these all among the Homo erectus. We find far more tools among Homo neanderthalensis. In fact, the tool kit for Homo neanderthalensis involves hundreds of tools. It's difficult to imagine that that a father would have told his son to go get him a specific tool simply by grunting. They would have had to have a word for these tools to get the right tool. So these are Acheulean stone tools. They require a great deal of work. And then the final stage of Homo erectus tool making are Levallois tools, which are much more elaborate, much sharper, much more attractive looking tools, they're functionally superior. And all the tools had to have these various components. So these are not like tools made by chimps. These are not like tools made by Australopithecus africanus. These are very important tools that represent cultural knowledge, cultural cooperation. And so if this is all the evidence that I had, I would say that Homo erectus was capable of symbols, and if it was capable of symbols, it had language. But this is not all the evidence that we have. We'll look at a little bit more of these tools. This is a 700,000-year-old shell found in Java. So this is long before Homo neanderthals came about in the world, long before humans, Homo sapiens. Actually, Homo erectus is human. Homo means human. So Homo erectus is human, Homo neanderthalensis is human, Homo sapiens is human. It's funny that we gave ourselves the name wise human, Homo sapiens, but the evidence for that is fairly weak at times. And so if you look at this shell very carefully, you can find these geometrical markings on the shell. Not only do you see the geometrical markings probably made by a shark's tooth, they're made in one motion without picking the shark's tooth up. They were trying to do something. They were representing something, or this isn't the only example. They actually did it in stone. So this is also done by Homo erectus. What did this mean? Well, we don't have any idea. It might not have meant anything except the attempt to express something. But this took a lot of work. This wasn't something that they just were doing play with. They were actually creating something, at the very least, you could say it was art. This is the oldest piece of art we actually know of, the Venus of Barakat Ram. What got me interested in the study of human evolution was touring the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. That's where this Venus is kept, and it said the world's oldest art, 250,000 years old, and I thought, They must have a zero off. They must have an extra zero there. It could only be 25,000 years old. But no, it's 250,000 years old, and it was done by Homo erectus. Because when Homo erectus went out of Africa, when Homo neanderthalensis went out of Africa, when Homo sapiens went out of Africa, they went through the Middle East. You just go to North Africa and turn right, you're out of Africa, that's the Middle East. And so a lot of these artifacts are found in the Middle East, what is today the Middle East. So this wasn't entirely shaped by Homo erectus, but we can see that they did do some shaping of it, and that it has dye on it, which indicates that they were decorating this. So what are the implications of Erectus tools? Well, they're symbolic and they show social components. They simultaneously are indexes of the task they have to do. So if you have a tool, it's going to indicate the task it's for. They're icons, they resemble other tools. They sort of work like a blueprint for other tools. And they're symbols of the value and labor of the community. Tools are all of that. Symbols in a linear order equal language. The leap to grammar is far smaller than the leap to symbols. To get a grammar, you first have to have symbols. You can't have grammar without symbols and call it a language. But we do find grammars without language in DNA. We find it in many ways that the universe is structured, RNA, bird speech or bird sounds. So we can find grammar apart from language. What makes the jump between grammar and language is the presence of symbols. I don't like the idea of a proto-language. I think once you have symbols and put them in an order, that's language, so I don't find the need for the term proto-language. It's like calling the first Ford automobile, the Model T, a proto-car. Actually, it was a car. So Homo erectus were humans. They weren't proto-humans, they were humans. But they were Model T humans. We're Ferrari humans. We're the souped-up version. So culture, in the sense that we've defined it here, was present among Homo erectus. To get from all these other things to modern languages, so Pitaha, for example, has very simple syntax, but its word structure is extremely complicated. So in English, how many verb forms do you have? Well, it's pathetic. You have 5. Sing, sang, sung, singing, sings. That's it. And so if you can't learn that in English, I don't know how to help you. Spanish or Portuguese will have 30 to 50 different forms for verbs. Pitaha has as many as 65,000 forms for any particular verb. So when I say that the syntax is simple, I don't mean that the whole language is simple. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it can start very simple and still do the same thing. Chinese shows us that we don't need any of those suffixes. We can simply have separate words. Chinese is to word structure like Pitaha is to sentence structure. It simply shows that there's nothing inferior about not having complex words. It's just another way that cultures choose to do things. So linguistic systems add all sorts of layers and make it more complicated. And the function of all layers, like I'm using gestures right now. I can't talk without using my hands, and neither can you. Nobody can. Even blind people use gestures when they talk. And why do we do that? Because we communicate with our entire body. Language is communication. Language is a special form of communication. It's the highest form of communication, and it's not just with our mouths that we communicate, not just with our brains, but with our entire body, our facial expressions. All of that is crucial to language. So that's one of the layers. Other layers are things like intonation. So yesterday, what did John give to Mary in the library? So it goes up and it goes down. Very simple. All languages use pitch. In Pitaha, we can say ear, which is awe, and skin, which is awe, and foreigner, which is awe, and Brazil nut shell, which is awe, and hand, which is awe. And if you can't hear the tones, here's another example. Magiai means friend. Magiai means enemy. Che means I. Che means excrement. So we add all these levels of sound, we individual sounds, all the way up to the conversational features that we use to keep things going. These things enhance speech, they make it easier to follow. So everything we add makes it easier to follow. And why do we want to make it easier to follow? Because language is communication. We do enhancement in grammar as well. So this is an icon. This is an icon of a sentence diagram. It shows that in a sentence, yesterday, what did John give to Mary in the library? There's a structure to it. That structure can help us interpret it, but it's not necessary. So I'm arguing, I have claimed in the past that there are languages that don't have that structure. Does that structure help? Yes. Is it necessary? No. And so there are all these different levels of grammar. There are morphemes, there are words, phrases, paragraphs. Piraha actually do have paragraphs. They don't write the language, but they use intonation to mark not only sentences, but paragraphs. So that's kind of interesting, and they have intonational features of discourse and intonational features of conversation. So all of these things exist in Piraha, even though the sentence itself is quite simple. Gestures are another thing that are very important. There are people who specialize in the study of gestures, and the gestures we use in spoken speech are not the same as the gestures that are used in sign language, because sign language is just another form of language, which shows that you don't even need to be able to make sounds to have a fully functioning language. Did Homo erectus start with sign language? I don't think so. I think it started with everything at once, because we communicate with our entire body. If we can use sounds, we will. If we can use gestures, we will. If we can use facial expressions, we will. Humans communicate with every tool at their disposal. Why? Because language isn't all that great. So you might have been in an argument with someone in your life. You might have gotten a divorce in your life, and it probably occurred as a breakdown in communication. If language were perfect, maybe there wouldn't be those kinds of arguments. But language doesn't always work. Language also doesn't tell us everything. It leaves context. So if you're waiting for your spouse and you're going to go to a party, and you say, "Are you ready yet?" and the spouse says, "Fix yourself a drink." What does that mean? What has that got to do with anything? It means I'm not ready yet, and don't bug me, just relax. I told a co-author last night over email in Boston, I said, "Have you finished your part of the paper yet? I'm really tired." He said, "Go to bed." That means he's not done yet. So all of these things play into it, as well as our cultural knowledge. We can't communicate without cultural knowledge. So Erectus traveled all over the world, the first travelers. They were in China almost 2 million years ago. They were in Greece. They were in modern-day Israel. They were all over the world. And in fact, we now know that they were in the Philippines 700,000 years ago. How did they get there? They didn't swim. They didn't ride a tsunami. Tsunamis don't go that way, by the way. You know, they go to land. They didn't get on a vegetable raft. They made a boat and they sailed there. That's the simplest, and that's not the only island they were at. So we're going to talk a little bit about this settlement in Israel, Gesher ben Yaakov, and then I'll stop and see if we have questions. I'll just go through some of this stuff. I'm going to skip that. So this settlement of Homo erectus is here in Israel, just above the Sea of Galilee. It's about 700,000 years old, 750,000. And excavations show that Erectus had settlements with specialized parts, one part for processing plants, one part for processing animals, one part that seemed to be more of a social space. So they had an organized village structure, and this is long before we came around. They also traveled the ocean, so there are many places across the ocean that we find Erectus settlements. 250,000 years ago, 700,000 years ago, there seems to have been an expansion about 700,000 years ago. And all of the places I'm going to show you have never been connected by land to where they got. They've always been separated by ocean. Flores, the island of Flores in Indonesia, is separated from land and was separated from land in the time of Homo erectus by the world's strongest ocean current. You cannot swim there. You cannot ride a raft there. If you try to ride a raft, you'll go out to the ocean. You've got to be able to paddle. You've got to be able to put some force behind it. Animals could swim across there. It's about the size of the English Channel back then. The island of Socotra, 1.4 million years ago, a Russian archaeological team has discovered evidence of Homo erectus settlements on this island 1.4 million years old. Erectus not only made tools, but they used tools. So we find this special axe. This is a hand axe, and it's colored, as you notice, and it's called Excalibur. That's a name some archaeologists gave it. But it was found with a skeleton, which seems to indicate that they buried the axe with the skeleton as a symbolic gesture. We also find these Shonigan spears, which are about 400,000 years ago. Larry told me recently, my co-author, that they probably are more recent than that. If they are, they could have been made by Erectus or they could have been made by Neanderthals. But they're very interesting tools, wood tools that have survived for hundreds of thousands of years. And they indicate culture and they indicate cooperation and social conventions. So 1.8 million years ago, symbols plus a G1 language, just symbols in linear order, would have been enough to say whatever they wanted to say, whatever we wanted to say. Does that mean that that's the kind of language they had? No, they could have had a language just as complicated as ours. But I'm simply saying that even with a language much simpler than ours, they would have had the ability to say whatever their culture wanted them to say. So how old is language? It's about 1.8 to 2 million years old. Neanderthals and sapiens were born into a linguistic world. There were a lot of Australopithecines. I won't tell you the names of all of these. I probably can't remember them myself. But these are just species of Australopithecines. Evolution did a lot of work before we ever appeared. Evolution was experimenting, killing off species. There were, according to some estimates, there were 20 species of humans before they got to us. And once again, somebody asked me at a presentation, if Erectus had language, why did they die out? Well, there are a lot of people in the world who died out who had perfectly functioning relative clauses. That doesn't preserve you all the time, as many people in Europe found out about 70 years ago. So the idea that humans die out doesn't necessarily imply anything about language, but we do know that Homo erectus evolved into us. So in a sense, they never died out, they became us. So I like this photo because it shows, you normally see the progression of males. So there's a progression of females evolving. And so we started about 6 million years ago, the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans lived. Ardipithecus. It's split into chimpanzees and humans. Chimpanzees are therefore our closest relatives. Some people have claimed that chimpanzees and humans are part of a larger genus, that we're just hairless chimpanzees. Somebody said, if you're right, humans are just talking apes. Well, that's right. We are talking apes. That's all we are. This is the planet of the apes, and we are in charge of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is the perfect time for you all to ask your questions that I do hope you have been thinking about for the past time. I don't know how it's going to go on technically. We do have a couple of microphones. We will start running around with them. And in between, I will, as usually, I will use and try to not abuse my privileges as a host and ask the first question. Which is about the relationship between tool use, tool making, and language. You said that there have been experiments that it's difficult to get a modern Homo sapiens PhD to learn to make a tool without language hints. Have there been contrary experiments where language use has been specifically off and yet people were able to learn to make tools? Because this seems to be a very strong argument for language use in Homo erectus, if it's impossible actually to learn without language.
Yes, they have definitely tried to get people to learn to make tools without using language, and they're not successful. As far as building boats, there's actually a paper by a linguist from the Max Planck Institute, David Gill, called How Much Language Does It Take to Build a Boat? And he talks about getting together, what would you need? Now, someone suggested that you could try this by getting 30 people to build a boat who all spoke different languages and couldn't communicate with each other. But they still have languages. So the only way to do this is to get 30 creatures who have no concept of language and see if they can build a boat. And the answer is no. And it's an answer from a thought experiment. There's no evidence to suggest they couldn't, except everything we know about the complexity of building boats. If they can't make stone tools, making a boat is a much harder thing.
But what about babies? I mean, babies don't have much language, but they do learn a lot.
Yes, they do. Babies, so what makes humans able to learn language when other creatures can't? Is there such a thing as a language organ? Well, it's not in the brain, it is the brain. It is the size of our brain and the structure of our memories and the rapidity of the connections between our brain, the rapidity of thought, the enormous memory we have, which children also have, far superior to other creatures, that enables them to start to learn. They're exposed. My dog knows quite a few words, so I know my dog can learn symbols. My dog knows the difference between past and present tense. So if I say to my dog, walk, she gets very excited and wants to go out the door. But when we come right back from a walk and I say the same thing, walk, she looks at me very puzzled. We just did a walk. So it shows that she understands more than we sometimes think dogs understand. And I love my dog. I think she's the smartest dog in the world, but compared to a child, she's stupid. I hate to say that, but so humans have huge advantages.
Okay, thank you. Now I will disappear from your side, but don't worry,
Okay,
I'm there.
if I can.
And I will start walking around and taking
Okay,
questions. By the way, is there a second microphone somewhere there, or am I the only person handing out voice to people?
There is one.
I deliberately ended a bit early so we could ask questions.
It was weird. We had a voice. All right, so I will start walking. I saw a hand over here. By the way, the questions may be asked in Polish as well. We can translate them on the go.
Yeah, I won't know what you're saying, but they will.
I have a question, but first of all, I'd like to mention you mentioned Neil Armstrong and how he said, one small step for man. He made a mistake, actually. He was supposed to say one small step for a man. A man, because it makes more sense.
Yeah, it
But
does.
I think he was a bit nervous or stressed at
I
the
would have
time.
been.
Just in regards to what you were saying before, that people, if they were trying to build a boat and they all spoke different languages, is it possible that they could actually communicate with signs instead of language? So maybe, before language actually came into being, maybe humans communicated with signs or facial expressions before language.
I think, they definitely communicated with signs, and they had to be symbolic signs, not simply indexical or iconic signs, to be able to communicate. There's a lot of research on signs in human speech. There's a 3-volume series by David McNeil from the University of Chicago, in which he tries to show how gestures and speech would not have been, if we started with sign language, for example, there would have been no need to develop the other. I mean, normally signs repel spoken speech. So the evidence suggests that we communicated with signs, with intonation, with sounds, all at the same time. They all started at once. I can't prove that. What I can say is that whether it was hand signs or vocal signs, they had to include symbols to be able to communicate these kinds of things.
Anyone? Yes.
So how was your studies of Pirahã language connected to the theory of Homo erectus speaking languages?
Okay, that's a good question. I mentioned the Pirahã. In a sense, not at all. In a sense, the Pirahã have nothing to do with Homo erectus. But in another sense, by doing field research, we are exposed to a vast variety of human language. we find possibilities that if we didn't do the field research, we would be unaware of. For example, if I hadn't done field research on the Piraha, I would not know that there are cultures that have no religion, that there are cultures that have no numbers, that there are cultures that where every person knows the name of every species in their environment. My knowledge of their species would have been very limited. The Piraha are hunter-gatherers. Homo erectus were hunter-gatherers. So in a sense, they had similar communicative needs. The Piraha are Homo sapiens. Homo erectus was not Homo sapiens. So they're quite different. Any Piraha would have been vastly, just as we would be, vastly more intelligent than Homo erectus. But that doesn't mean that Homo erectus can talk. So the main thing Piraha tells me is that you don't need elaborate grammar to have a perfectly functioning language. But other than that, it has no connection. This is a different line of research.
Thank you. So why do we need elaborate grammars at all? Or what makes us choose grammar 1, grammar 2, grammar 3?
Okay, so that's also a very good question. When you have, so for example, when you introduce literacy into any society, the grammar changes. It becomes more complex. We write more complex sentences than we speak. Why do we do that? Because you can pack more information into an individual sentence, and you don't have to worry about memory because you can go back to the page. Each one of these grammatical elaborations makes it easier to interpret the symbols. They rely less on context and more on the grammar itself. So grammar is a huge aid to interpreting symbols. The Piraha, for example, recursion is not useful to them because there's a lot of noise in the environment. So they repeat a lot of things. If you see a Piraha story, they repeat the same thing over and over. Why do they do that? It's not because they can't remember what they said, but it's because there's noise in the environment, and the more I repeat it, the easier it is to follow the story. Whereas in industrial societies, we have many aids to recover the information. So all of these grammars work, but the G3 grammar has a number of devices that are more efficient for packing information tightly. So if you want the information packed tightly, recursion is great, hierarchy is great. If you want it spread out and you want a slower information rate because of noise in the environment and ability to recover what was said, G1 is better.
There are some psychological knowledge about that we cannot perceive physically, the things that we cannot name with language. And I was thinking, well, what do you think about that?
Yes, my son, who is an anthropologist and psychologist at the University of Miami, has written a book on this very idea. And it is true that our language affects the way we think, but not entirely, or science would not be possible. Science is discovering things we didn't have words for. When the physicist Murray Gell-Mann discovered a particle, there was no name for that particle, so he took a word from James Joyce, from Finnegan's Wake, and he called it a quark. That's fine. He found something there was no name for. So our languages do affect the way we think, but they don't determine the way we think. We can always get outside of our language. They're not a straitjacket. They're not a prison. It's very popular to think that we cannot think outside of our language, but we can. This is a question here.
I think I'll be...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I can't see anything because
Sure,
of the light.
I do.
Hello.
I'd sort of invite you to speculate a little bit. When do you think that prayer, poetry, and song, and obviously there's a reason that I'm bracketing those together, start to emerge?
Well, intonation, pitch, the frequency of our vocal cords. So we cannot make sounds without pitch being involved. We have vibrations in our vocal cords. Each individual sound has what is called its fundamental frequency. That would have been present with Erectus from the very beginning. Also, so that's the basis of music. All music comes from the fundamental frequency of the human voice singing. But we also, as humans, we play with things. So as soon as we had symbols, somebody was using them in unexpected ways. And when you start doing things in unexpected ways, you lead to artistic forms of language, or you don't have communication. So the first attempts to communicate would have relied heavily on context. But I think these kinds of things probably entered early on. I mean, what else did humans have to do? You know, if you find your food and, you know, you can have sex and then you do something else. So there's not a whole lot of alternatives if you're a hunter-gatherer. The Piraha spend most of their day talking because it's very easy to find food. So it takes about 15 hours a week for the Piraha to provide food for their family. Pretty easy, 2 hours a day and you've got all the fish you need. So sit around and talk and tell jokes. So they tell jokes and laugh and make fun of me and stuff like that.
I've got two questions. First, why not Homo habilis? They produce tools. How they did it without language? And second question, why Homo erectus, if they had language, why the progress was so slow? It was 1 million years of boredom, really. tools and
Very good questions. On Homo habilis, I'm not at all sure that they were different from Homo erectus. I know that's a common view, but Homo habilis was a precursor of Homo erectus and might have just been another version of Homo erectus. We know too little about those species still to say with precision or with certainty that Homo habilis was definitely a different species from Homo erectus. So I sort of lumped them together. As far as, okay, so Homo erectus had language. Why did it take him so long to do things? We don't know what that question means. What does it mean to say it takes us so long? You know, why has it taken humans so long to give up clothes? I mean, we still wear clothes. Maybe someday we won't wear clothes. And then people will say, why did people use clothes for so long? There are certain tools that we use. Cultures are very conservative. And the obvious fact that Erectus was not as smart as we are. Innovation, there are two great forces in society, imitation and innovation. Imitation is when you wear a jersey of your favorite hockey player or your favorite football player, or you act like someone else, you sing their music. Innovation is usually fatal. It usually doesn't work. If you want to make money, you've got to be innovative. But most innovative people don't make money. They just are looked at like idiots. So if you come to school dressed differently, you just look strange. So when the environment stays the same, it always favors imitation because the problem has already been solved and you just imitate and you've got the solution. Why screw up a good thing? But when the environment changes, innovation can be favored. So innovation is to culture as mutation is to biology. And it's usually fatal. So if cultures are doing okay, they don't tend to innovate much.
I'm sorry, I was supposed to interject between, but the microphone didn't work, but I have to ask you this question. Do you know any Piraha jokes?
Most Piraha jokes have to do with things that I couldn't say here, or that they really do.
You may freely, we're among humanists.
Right,
you know,
right.
There's nothing alien to us.
Well, I remember as a missionary, I told the Piraha about Jesus for the first time. And the next day, a Piraha man came to me and says, okay, we don't want to hear any more about Jesus. Why not? Because last night, he came into the village and he had a penis this big. That was very funny to them. They thought that was very funny. I have no idea what that means. But everybody was laughing when he told me that. So he said it scared all the women, and so we don't want to hear any more about him. So that's a Piraha joke.
Thank you, thank you. We all learned something today. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I'm here on your right.
Oh,
yeah,
there you
right
go.
there. Thanks a lot for the very interesting lecture. So actually, what was interesting for me, you said that the most difficult part actually in learning language is learning symbols, not actually the grammar. So it's quite counterintuitive to what we think as humans. So my question would be, having in mind that we have a lot of different languages in the world, and surely they interact with different, I would say, within different cultures, we have to learn different tones or more complicated grammar. Does language in which you are being born and through years and thousands of years, your ancestors, etc., does have any effect on our brain? And are there any languages that enhances some particular skills within particular cultures?
Yes, language is a cognitive technology. So, for example, there are societies that I have done field research on that have no numbers, not even the number 1. Unsurprisingly, they don't do math. That doesn't mean that the people are too stupid to do math. It means that their language doesn't have the cognitive technology to do math. And in the history of our species, many societies, when they came into contact with other societies that had math, invented math. So that's just one example, but there are all sorts of things. You know, the Piraha don't name colors. Some people find it odd that the Piraha don't have numbers and they don't name colors, but they are sort of the, if you're a philosopher, they are the ultimate nominalists. They are not realists, they are nominalists. They don't believe in the universal things. They don't talk about the universal things. They talk, so David Hume would have been quite at home with the Piraha. And it has nothing to do with intelligence. It's a philosophical perspective on the universe. So yes, language is a cognitive technology, and some languages facilitate things and dampen other things. But the interesting thing about our species is that we evolved to be flexible. We didn't evolve. Humans have about 23,000 genes. Corn has about 46,000 genes. Why does corn have so many more genes than we do? Well, one possible explanation is because our genes work together to produce flexibility and give us many more options. They're like letters of the alphabet that combine and have a syntax. Corn has to have everything determined for it. If it floods where there's corn, the corn will not get up and walk away. It will just die. We move. If it's raining, we go find some place where it's not raining. Humans are flexible. Anything one human can do, another human can do. But they probably won't, because if they were raised in different cultures, they will have different values, different knowledge structures, different ways of talking, and different ways of thinking. So make sure all of your children are bilingual.
I think we have space for 2, 3 more questions. I see one in the back and one at the front.
I would like to ask about the process of learning a Piraha language. What were the first steps, and is there any methodology? How is it even possible to learn such a language?
For me to learn it, or for a child Piraha to learn it?
For you, as someone who comes from different
So
cultures.
for me, I got off the airplane for the first time, 2-hour flight in, and the Piraha surrounded the airplane. I'm a linguist. I also was very airsick. I felt like vomiting, but I couldn't because there was a big crowd there. So I picked up a stick and I said, stick. And a Piraha man said, I thought, that probably means stick. So then I dropped it. And I said, stick falls. And he said, himige kaube. I said, that probably means stick fell to the ground. I hear stick in there. You know, himige kaube. So then I picked up 2 sticks, and I thought they had numbers then, but I said, 2 sticks fall. He said, himige kaube. And then I picked up a leaf. Tai himige kaube, tai huehio himige kaube. Then I got colors, and then I sat down, and they say, abai bit. And I stood up, and they said, sit behind. So by the end of the day, I was, making sentences. Actually, there's a demonstration of me doing this for the Linguistic Society of America with a totally different language, where I speak Piraha, and this person speaks their language. So if you look, Dan Everett monolingual demonstration, you'll see how I did that. It's sort of how children learn it, except they have a lot more loving care than I did. And they also are exposed to the language 24 hours a day. And children start to learn the language when? In the womb. In the womb, they can already feel their mother's intonational structures. They can tell what kind of foods the mother eats. If the mother eats a lot of chili peppers, the child is going to feel that. The child starts learning about diet, about fear, about intonation, all these things in the womb. So they don't come out as a blank slate. They come out with knowledge.
Yes. By the way, I'm going to interject again. I have the microphone. You know, that's nice. But you learning language is something you do without linguistic instructions, right?
Exactly.
I mean, this is a very complex skill that, by definition, you have to learn without linguistic instructions. So, wouldn't this be an indication that you can learn extremely complicated processes without any sort of linguistic help?
Except that language bootstraps on itself. It's a cyclical process. As soon as you learn the first word, you use that to learn the second word. So it's
yeah, but
always
boat building as well, I guess.
Yes,
You
but
get
boat
better,
building.
you know?
So what's the difference between learning a language and learning to build a boat? Learning your first language is building your identity. It's becoming who you are and becoming part of the culture. It is constructing a bridge of communication between yourself and your parents. You've got to do that or you don't survive. So learning a language is the most important. It's also the most complicated task we'll ever learn. Obviously, learning to build a boat is trivial compared to learning a language, but the motivation to build a boat is quite different. And so it also requires cooperation. I mean, one person, according to the Bible, Noah built a big boat pretty much by himself. So it can be done, apparently, by itself, but when it requires cooperation, all of these other tasks, we know they require social engagement. Language requires social engagement. It's even harder, but the child's survival depends on it, and their identity depends on it, as the psychologist Jean Piaget said.
Okay, thank you. I've seen hands, if I may say so.
Hi, I believe you said that the language that a culture speaks answers needs within that culture.
Yes.
And I believe you said that in Piraha, verbs have as many as 65,000 forms, is that right?
Yes.
What does the Piraha language need 65,000 forms?
Good question. They don't have tenses, so in all those 65,000 forms, there's no past tense, future tense, present tense. But what there is in all those things is directional markers that tell you, well, first there's aspect. It'll tell you whether the action was complete or is it ongoing, or whether it was just not finished. It will tell you, let's say, I saw a bird. The verb will have to tell me whether the bird was vertically above me, where it was on the horizon, whether it was in a tree. There are little suffixes that indicate all of this. That's very useful if you're a hunter-gatherer. So they have these complex structures. It turns out that humans are pretty smart. They can learn those complex structures. The Piraha, when I'm with them in the jungle, they'll point to something and they'll say, "What is that, Dan? What do you call that in English?" "Tree." "And what's that?" "Tree." "What's that?" "Tree." "You just have the same word for all of these things?" "Yeah, that's all I have. Some people know more." They call them all by their species name, because they know what they all are. Every child knows that. They take me into the jungle. The favorite Piraha game, you talk about jokes, we walk maybe 3, 4, 5 kilometers out into the jungle, and then they say, "Dan, take us back." Because they know I don't know where I'm at. And so it's so fun to watch me lost. They'll go hunting, and they'll say, "Dan, you're making too much noise. You stand right here. We'll come get you." So I stand by a tree, and my bones would still be by that tree if they hadn't come to get me. So there's a lot of cultural information I would need to survive in the jungle. I don't know how to hunt. I don't know how to fish. They worry about me. I'm totally incompetent as a human being. But somehow I have money, and that allows me to buy food. They don't understand money. They say, "How do you get money? You just sit on your butt all day." That's how professors make a living, sitting on their butt all day.
I think we will do the last question. We are on a high note. Let's end on a high note. A second one. Wow. Well.
So
There's somebody in the back there. Oh, I don't know if you've already asked a question. If somebody who hasn't.
I would like to ask about the way our language shapes our brain. So you said that societies that don't have any names for numbers and don't have any quantifiers, like the Piraha,
Right.
are not able to do maths logically. But you also wrote in one of your articles about the Piraha that they were, when they were trading with Brazilians who came by boat to their village, they were able to tell somehow which of them were honest and which were not honest, and they were right in their judgment. So
Yes.
how come they were able to do that?
Because they can recognize quantities. So if I give you this many Brazil nuts, and you give me back this many goods, fine. If I give this guy that many Brazil nuts, and he gives me back this many goods, he's better. So it's recognition of relative quantities and not counting that enables us to do that. They do recognize that when I go to the Brazilians, I know exactly what I'm going to get for my money. This puzzles them because they never know exactly what they're going to get. And so if the trader is dishonest, they get very little. If they're honest, they get more. But the trader who gives them more will be the more popular one, unless the trader gives them whiskey, in which they'll always trade with them. Because that's the number one thing, even though it's the cheapest thing to buy is cachaça. There's artichoke cachaça, which costs about 39 cents a bottle, and they like that.
By the way, you only have to observe kindergarten kids trading stuff. They don't know mathematics, but they know exactly the value of every toy. And this is full-fledged economics with perfect precision, with zero mathematics. And I have two small kids, and they are perfect in balancing value, but they don't know mathematics.
Well, if you look at the U.S. comedy movie Home Alone, if you saw that movie, Macaulay
Every
Culkin,
Christmas. Every Christmas.
Macaulay Culkin gets left behind. And nowadays he's left behind as an actor, nobody cares about him. But he was left behind as a child. Why was he left behind as a child? Because his parents counted the children. A Piraha would never do that. They would look each child in the face, and they would know their children are there. The Piraha don't need to know how many children they have. They know who their children are, and they don't leave without them. So in a sense, that's an advantage.
I mean, this is such an excellent point that I just want to end the question series just to end on this excellent point. So thank you very much, Professor, and that's
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and let's meet again at one of the other fantastic events of the Copernicus Festival. Have a good evening. Thank you.